At 2040, while cruising over the Indian Ocean south of Java, a strange phenomenon suddenly appeared across the windshield of the Boeing 747. It was steady, Elmo's fire. A natural phenomenon caused by electrically charged regions inside thunderstorms, reducing the flight crew's visibility to a critical level. And that meant one thing. Yes, exactly. Right ahead of the aircraft was a violently erupting volcano. All the passengers froze in shock. But that still wasn't the worst part. The biggest problem was this. All 4 engines began failing one after another and burst into flames. The lives of nearly 300 people hung between life and death. Would Steedy Elmo pray for them? Would a true hero emerge to save the aircraft? Or would the plane collide with the volcano and plunge into the freezing Indian Ocean? June 24, 1982, Sultan Abdul Aziz Airport, Malaysia. 19 o'clock Flight 9, also known as Speedbird 9, a scheduled international service operated by British Airways from London Heathrow Airport to Auckland Airport, New Zealand, was making a refueling stop in preparation for the 5-hour leg to Perth, Australia. The flight was operated by a Boeing 747, one of the largest passenger aircraft in the world. There were 263 people on board, including 248 passengers and 15 crew members. The captain was 41-year-old Eric Moody, the pilot in command of the flight, one of the youngest captains at British Airways, and notably, he had previously been a glider pilot. Remember this detail, because his role would become crucial. The first officer was Roger Greaves, 32 years old, alongside senior flight engineer Barry Townley Freeman. At exactly 8 o'clock p.m. local time, the aircraft began takeoff. The massive Boeing roared down the runway with thunderous engine noise, heading southeast toward Perth. Eric guided the aircraft to a cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. The crew could finally relax. At 20:15, the cabin crew announced dinner service. The main course on today's menu was satay, a famous Malaysian specialty. "40 minutes after takeoff, danger began to emerge. At 20:40, the aircraft was flying over the Indian Ocean south of Java, a large island in Indonesia. What neither the passengers nor the crew realized was that directly beneath them, a volcano known as Mount Galunggung was erupting continuously and violently. For several months, it had been spewing massive amounts of ash and volcanic debris into the atmosphere. Back in the 1980s, knowledge about volcanic ash hazards was still limited, so there had been no warning reports about the danger. After finishing his meal, the captain handed control of the aircraft to the first officer and went to the lavatory. Before leaving, he checked the weather radar once more and confirmed that everything appeared completely normal. But as soon as the captain returned to the cockpit, he was stunned. Blue flashes of light, resembling electrical arcs, danced across the windshield. The strange phenomenon and its eerie glow created an almost surreal scene. So beautiful that flight engineer Freeman exclaimed, "Look at that, it's beautiful." The phenomenon the crew was witnessing is scientifically known as St. Elmo's fire. It is named after Saint Elmo, the patron saint of sailors. According to legend, Saint Elmo would pray for and warn sailors of impending danger or disastrous events about to occur. Recognizing that something was wrong, the captain immediately scanned the weather radar again, but there was no indication of storms or any abnormal weather activity. At the same time, inside the passenger cabin, smoke began to accumulate. At first, it was suspected to be cigarette smoke. However, the haze grew thicker and carried a strong sulfur smell. Could see an unusual blue glow shining forward along the engine nacelles and creating a stroboscopic effect. 2 minutes later, all 4 engines failed simultaneously. 2042 Jakarta time. Engine number 4, a Rolls-Royce RB211, surged violently and burst into flames. The captain immediately carried out the engine shutdown procedure, cutting off the fuel supply and discharging the fire extinguishing system. Fortunately, a large aircraft like the Boeing 747 can continue normal flight with 1 engine inoperative. But just 1 minute later, at 2043, engine number 2 suddenly surged and caught fire. Within seconds, almost simultaneously, engines number 1 and number 3 also began flaming out. Flight engineer Barry Townley Freeman shouted, "I don't believe it, all 4 engines have failed." The aircraft had now become a giant glider, drawing closer to the Indian Ocean with every passing minute. To avoid an aerodynamic stall, the captain lowered the nose of the aircraft to maintain safe airspeed. Meanwhile, the first officer and flight engineer worked desperately to restart the engines. Without engine thrust, the Boeing 747 had a glide ratio of approximately 15:1, meaning that for every 15 kilometers traveled forward, the aircraft would lose 1 kilometer of altitude. The captain calculated that they could glide only another 169 kilometers, about 23 minutes remaining. At 2044, First Officer Greaves declared an emergency to air traffic control. Jakarta ATC, this is Speedbird 9. All 4 engines have failed. However, the Jakarta controller appeared to misunderstand the first officer's transmission, interpreting it as only engine number 4 having failed. Engine number 4 has failed. Try to maintain control on 3 engines. I will guide you for a landing. Nearest airport in Jakarta, but fortunately, a nearby Garuda Indonesia flight picked up and relayed the message for them. Only then did ATC fully understand the emergency call from Speedbird 9. Although the crew had already set transponder code 7700 to declare an emergency, air traffic control still could not locate the 747 on radar. 30,000 feet and still descending. Reach Halim Airport. Just clear a mountain range. Minimum safe altitude is 11,500 feet. See that. Receiving the information from ATC, crew became deeply concerned. On the captain's calculations, it would be difficult to maintain 12,000 feet while reaching the mountains, and they might have to attempt reaching in the Indian Ocean. So the heart or trust logic? Aircraft had now descended to 26,000 feet, and pressure dropped rapidly. Oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling. Automatic emergency measure. Compensate for the lack of oxygen. For First Officer Greaves' oxygen mask failed. Those had detached from the mask. Without enough oxygen, he would soon lose consciousness. At that moment, the captain faced an extremely difficult decision. Descend so the first officer could breathe. Preserve their precious altitude. Maximize the chance of restarting the engines. And the captain and flight engineer chose bring the aircraft lower. First officer was essential. Leaving the aircraft. Captain deployed speed brakes. Descended to 20,000 feet. Rapid descent and deceleration. Passengers forward. Lined with thick smoke. The engine fires. Everyone fell into panic, and anxiety spread through the cabin. under intense pressure. Captain Moody made an announcement to calm the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have a small problem. 4 engines have stopped. Doing everything possible to restart them. Hope you are not too concerned." For the captain's announcement, and doubt only gave way to acceptance. He believed they were about to die. The atmosphere inside the cabin was heavy. The cabin was eerily quiet. The aircraft had now descended to 13,500 feet, around 4,100 meters. The first officer was breathing normally again. After repeated failures, 3 crew members trying to restart the engines. As for them, impossible did not exist. Ahead was a mountain range, clearly visible in the darkness. Altitude warning, 12,000 feet, was the point where they might have to ditch. No procedures for water landings existed. The crew never attempted it in a Boeing 747. Survival odds were extremely low. The aircraft hit the ocean, it was over. As death seemed near, crew's efforts finally paid off. 2056, engine number 4 restarted. Pilots were overjoyed. After, engine number 3 restarted, allowing the aircraft to climb slowly. Then a minute later, engines number 1 and 2 restarted as well. First officer quickly informed ATC the situation, requested a higher altitude, clear the Indonesian mountains. Cleared to climb to 15,000 feet. Safely crossed the mountains. The ordeal was not over. The aircraft reached cruising altitude again. Boost DT. Elmo's glow returned to the windshield. Captain shouted, "Have to get out of this." Realized volcanic ash was likely causing engine failures. The aircraft descended again. Engine number 2 shook violently. It could tear itself apart at any moment. Captain Moody shut down engine number 2, or it caused catastrophic damage. Aircraft now continued on 3 engines. Crew descended. Stabilized at 12,000 feet, approaching Halim Perdanakusuma International Airport. Another challenge remained. Volcanic ash had coated the windshield, severely reducing visibility. The crew decided to perform an almost entirely manual approach. ATC delivered more bad news. Vertical guidance system unavailable at the airport. The crew had to fly a non-precision approach. In poor weather conditions, pilots cannot see the runway. Only rely on DME distance readings. Calculate the required altitude at each point. Following the final approach path, aircraft descended along imaginary glide slope. Ensure a safe landing. The approach turned just a small clear strip on the windshield. Not been damaged by the ash, allowing him to see ahead more clearly. Assistance from the first officer, Siang. Boeing 747 landed safely. For leaving the aircraft, had nearly crashed minutes earlier. Passengers hugged each other and waved at the crew. The cause. The question now was, caused 4 engines to fail? Investigation revealed aircraft had flown through a volcanic ash cloud. Mount Galunggung's eruption. As the ash cloud was dry, not appear on weather radar. Detects moisture in clouds. Ash cloud disrupted airflow, starving the engines of oxygen, blasting the windshield, clogging the engines. Volcanic ash entered the engine, melted inside the combustion chamber, coated engine components. The aircraft descended below the ash cloud. Molten ash cooled and broke away, allowing normal airflow to return. Engines could then restart successfully. Engines restarted because aircraft still had electrical power and battery supply. Ignition and gratitude. Speedbird 9 crew received numerous awards, including the Queen's Commendation, Valuable Service in the Air for Captain Moody, medals from the British Airline Pilots Association. Powerless flight entered the Guinness Book of Records, the longest glide by a non-specialized aircraft. Time. A life fairy tale also emerged from that flight. 1993, passenger Theo Hutchinson married fellow passenger James Ferguson, who had been seated in front of her that day. Later wrote a book titled "Four Engines Have Failed." Recounts experience aboard the doomed flight. Expresses gratitude to the crew. Later said that on June 24, 2007, passengers and crew members night to celebrate 55 years since unforgettable adventure changed their lives forever.